Good morning. My name is Frank Ramos. I'm with Clark Silverglade here in Miami, and I have the privilege to have Hannah Hembree Bell with us this morning to discuss her practice and her career. She'll be talking a lot about marital issues, and the title of her presentation will be Don't Give Away the Farm, Protecting Your Assets Before, During, and After Marriage. And if you see me sort of looking away, I'm in charge of the room, so I'll be letting folks in as I speak. So I may look a little distracted, and I apologize for that. As we go along, feel free to type in your questions on the bottom of the screen, and I would ask that you keep yourselves on mute. This thing is being recorded, this presentation, just so that you're aware, and it will be downloaded and shared later. So if you have to leave unexpectedly, or if you enjoy what you hear and you want to share it with others, we will provide you a link at a later time and date. Without further ado, here is Hannah, and she will be discussing issues regarding marital assets.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. As Frank said, I am Hannah Hembree Bell, and I am a family law and estate planning lawyer based in Austin, Texas. We have an office in San Antonio. And Frank and I met, much how several of you, I'm sure, who are here know Frank the same way. I followed him on LinkedIn and was super impressed and inspired and he made me think a lot about different lawyer things. And then I'm one of the ones who took Frank up on an offer. Hey, if you're ever in Miami, let's meet for coffee. And we did. And I now consider him a trusted resource and someone I call if I'm kind of stuck in my practice and have questions and things like that. And so we talked about, hey, let's do a Zoom with to talk about some family law issues impacting people, particularly lawyers, but I think we may have some non-lawyers here today. So like Frank said, title of our talk is don't give away the farm, protecting yourself before, during, and after marriage. And I think I should have said, don't give away the farm accidentally. Because look, I want to start this to say you can give away the farm if you want to. And I tell my clients that all the time. I just want to make sure that you understand what you're doing and don't just sort of go in blind. Because where this, I guess, idea for the topic came to me is because in my practice, I deal with a lot of really smart, educated professionals, lawyers, doctors, accountants, counselors, business owners. And I am often really shocked at how little these genius people know about the way finances work. And look, it's just not, maybe they're, except for the CPAs, they're different, but it's just not their area necessarily. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think sometimes it's just it's fuzzy. I don't know. I find it hard to understand some of this stuff. And so my goal today is just to break it down a little bit. And I always say I talk in regular people language. So in regular folks of, what do I need to know in terms of protecting myself financially if divorce were ever to come for me? Okay. Now, I think to understand where you start, you need to learn and understand where you're going to end up. And so what we'll do is we'll start out by talking about the two distinct frameworks in the US that are used in most jurisdictions upon divorce for asset allocation. And there's a minority view, those are community property states, and there's a majority view, those are equitable division states. And I'm going to start with community property states and minority. I'm from Texas. We're a community property. So, Texas, we always think we go first, right? So I'll start there. And I think in understanding community property, one of the main things you've got to get in your head is this line of demarcation. And that's going to be the date of marriage, because that's sort of the key turning point in your assets upon divorce. So everything beyond the date of marriage, that's considered community property. Everything prior to the date of marriage is considered separate property. And anything you get by gift or inheritance during the marriage is also considered separate property. Okay, so separate communities, so what? Like, who cares, Hannah? I hear you. You're going to care a lot by the end of this. But you have to understand a key concept, and that's inception of title. So for any lawyers with us today, you remember this from law school. When did you get or acquire the right to own this asset? When did you own it? When did you get title? That's the key question, because that's what we look to determine the character of an asset. When did you get title to it? So if it was before marriage or through a gift or an inheritance, that's considered separate. And if it was after marriage, that's considered community. And so, generally speaking, the way courts do it in community property states is take the community property that's split with a just and right division, or that sort of means somewhat fair. It really kind of means 50-50. Okay. You can vary from that for different reasons, like infidelity in Texas. And I think most states, community property states, do this, different reasons. You can vary from that 50-50, but you're going to split the community property piece. And the separate property piece, whatever you bring in, you're going to take out, so long as you can trace it through. Okay, so that's very different from the way other states do this. With separate property, I try to think of how to understand this is, like the PETA people who throw like red paint on people wearing furs. I call it red paint money. Okay, so your separate property funds have red paint on them, and so long as you can trace that red paint money through the marriage, you're going to be able to take it back out, and that's through different experts, and I'll talk some more about that. But say the best way to think about it is, say when you get married, you have $100,000 in the bank, and you use that $100,000 and you buy a fancy boat, and then you sell the boat and you buy a car, and you sell the car and you have $25,000 left. So long as you can trace the funds through that, follow that red paint with clear and convincing evidence, you're going to get that money back out. It's not subject to the 50-50 division. Now, there is another concept of reimbursement. So the best way to think about it is buckets. So you have a community property bucket that gets divided, and you have a separate property bucket that gets divided, but they kind of can give each other money, pour money into one bucket or the other. Like if when you get married, you own a house and that's your separate property asset and y'all live in the house, but you use money from your job, income that you gain during the marriage, which is community, to satisfy the separate property debt, then the separate property owes the community money. You have to pay it back upon divorce. So it's like a little loan, kind of back and forth. This one's going to come up a lot in our talk today, is the way that businesses are treated if you own it prior to marriage in these kind of jurisdictions. So say you own a law firm or a CPA firm or a house painting business before marriage, and it's worth $10,000. You've got $10,000 in the bank. You just started it a year before, and the value of it's about 10,000, just your assets. And while you're married for 20 years, you turn that house painting business into like the house painters of the universe business, and it's worth $10 million. That appreciation on your separate property asset, that's all separate property. If you owned it before, that value, you get to take it. Very different than the way it works in the majority jurisdictions with equitable division. So that's a key thing to understand. And I see several names that I know you're in Texas. So this can often feel unfair upon divorce. You have this little business that was nothing when you get married to somebody, they grow it huge, they get it all, and you get nothing from it. It's a little harsh, but one of I think the values in community property jurisdictions is that they're a little bit more predictable. There are some hard and fast rules for the way that it works. So at least in Texas, when you go into, say you're going to the judge or the jury, you kind of know the way certain things are going to work. There's settled law on this gets divided like that. You can't award separate property assets to the other spouse. You can't the court cannot do that. It doesn't have the right or jurisdiction or whatever to do that. So there's sort of this, at least we know what we're getting into fact with community. Okay. Now, we need to think, let me tell you real quick in case you're like, is that me? There are 9 states that have community property laws: Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Washington, Wisconsin. And I'm going to say there's a +1 because apparently in Alaska, you can opt in to community property. I don't really know how. I'm sure you have to file some form, but anyway, 9+1. And for the rest of y'all, including Florida, where Frank is from, and Georgia and New York and the other states, they are an equitable division jurisdiction. Now, for us lawyer sorts, when you hear the word equitable, you think in terms of fairness, right? And one of the problems with fairness, it sounds good, is someone's got to decide what's fair. and that's going to be the judge or the jury, right, depending on the situation. Now, one distinction here is the way that these assets are treated in terms of they don't have that concept of separate, but they do have buckets of non-marital assets, premarital assets, and marital assets. And some of the jurisdictions, they use what's called the source of funds rule. So where did these funds come from? And there are a few key concepts to equitable division states. You can not commingle your assets or they lose their character. So if you take that premarital money or that non-marital money that's an inheritance or a gift or something, and you put it into that marital bank account, it loses its character as a premarital asset, right? Very different than community where you just trace it and you get it back out. So you do not commingle assets in an equitable division jurisdiction. The other thing is you don't change title, because if you change title, the nature of the asset changes and you can't go back, basically. So if you have a separate property house when you get married and, oh, you just love your little honey so much, and after the wedding, you want to refi and then add them to the title or whatever, you've made that a marital asset that you've got to split. So you have to be very careful. Don't commingle, don't change title. Now, the big difference I was telling you about is the way businesses are treated. So let's go back to our $10,000 painting company business. It's $10,000, your husband owns it before marriage, and it's just basically a bunch of nothing. And y'all work together, he works on it, and marital effort, his efforts during the marriage increase the value to the $10 million. That appreciation is divisible as a marital asset. Very different than, hey, it's mine in community property jurisdictions. And that's really going to inform some of the advice that we give. But one thing to keep in mind, if community property gives you some hard and fast rules, mostly kind of, equitable division is about fairness, and it's all in that judge's hands, which for lawyers, that should kind of give us a little of the heebie-jeebies, right? Because some judges are great, some are not. And it can be scary. You really put your future in the hands of someone who doesn't know your life. So my takeaway in researching the equitable division states was, look, if I was in equitable division state, I'd be settling my case before I put it in the judge or the jury's or an arbitrator's hands who doesn't know us. And I'm going to mention one little thing that affects in both. You may be wondering about alimony, or as it's called in Texas, spousal maintenance, and how that works. Well, if you think about it, it's going to work differently in the different kinds of jurisdictions, right? Equitable division is going to be what's fair, what makes it right. If you're a stay-at-home mom and your husband was a fancy lawyer like Frank Ramos, then there may be this bigger award of alimony to sort of level the playing field. She stayed home and raised kids. He was out working. We got to make this fair for the long term. Or you may get a big lump sum alimony payment. Now in Texas, for instance, not so much. There are hard and fast rules. There are caps. If you go to the judge, there's a cap on how much it can be. It's a percentage of income. There's a formula. There's no like fairness standard of living thing unless you can agree to that at mediation. Okay, so very different. It really matters which state you're in. All right, now that we understand the two frameworks, I think we should split up the rest of our time in talking about what you can do before, what you should be doing during, and what you can do after marriage. Now, in terms of before, the goal here is to protect yourself, not perfection. So it's protection, not perfection. Okay. What you're trying to do is on the front end, minimize the number of unresolved issues on the back end, because things that are unresolved have to go to a judge, a jury, a mediator, or you got to duke it out with I call them X factor, the X factor. Okay. So you want to minimize the number of unresolved issues. So don't freak out about perfection and, oh, I can't do all of that, so I'm going to do none of it. Okay, that's how some people kind of are. Now, the gold standard would be to get a prenuptial agreement or an antemarital or a premarital agreement, an agreement before you get married. All right, technically, legally, that's definitely the least risky, most protective thing that you can do. And with these, you're only really limited by public policy and the creativity of the lawyers involved. What these can do is they can change the way the laws work within your marriage, within your greater jurisdiction. So you can find in a marital property agreement, hey, we're not going to create marital property. We're not going to create any community property. If we buy an asset, it's definitely going to be separate property, right? It's basically a divorce in advance. You can delineate how property is taken, how title's taken, who pays what that means. What if there's intellectual property? What if there's a patent? All of those issues you can take care of on the front end. Now, except, like I said, public policy, generally speaking, I'm not aware of, maybe somebody here maybe and can pipe up, but that you can't really deal with kid issues, child support, who gets custody of the kids, et cetera, upon divorce. That part you can't handle on the front end. So keep that in mind. Even if you do all of this, you're still going to have the kid fight, which is not really the subject. That's a different Zoom. But you can get all the money stuff worked out. A couple things to keep in mind. You want to think about timing of doing this. If you get engaged, that's the time where you need to start getting your prenup done. Don't wait till the week of marriage and on the way, in the limo at the church, hey, by the way, if you'd like to do this today, I'd like you to sign this here paper, okay? That is not the way to go about doing it. Really, I think interpersonal, I'm a practical person, if nothing else. And interpersonally, the way to do this is if you're dating someone, you kind of just like drop little hints along the way about my parents will make me get a prenup, or I'd have to do this because I have these separate assets, whatever. Start dropping breadcrumbs along the way so that when you get engaged, this is not a shock. This is not going to be the thing that blows up your engagement, right? You need to start so that when you get engaged, y'all go get the lawyers, because each of you needs a lawyer. Okay. Y'all go get the lawyers and get started on this deal. You're really doing a big transaction, or, you're going to merge. So you got to paper the deal. Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is disclosures. This is a little weird. So the different jurisdictions require a different level of disclosure, and you just need to make sure that you understand the disclosure required. And if you're hiring a lawyer who does this, that they understand the disclosure required. Okay. So in Texas, for instance, you have to give a fair and reasonable disclosure of all of your assets to the other party so they know what they're giving up. Versus in Georgia, you have to give a full and fair disclosure. And lawyers here, those things mean different things, fair and reasonable versus full. So apparently in Georgia, a lot of lawyers don't like the premarital agreements because of this full disclosure and the liability it can put on you as the lawyer to make sure you've got everything. So just keep in mind the disclosure requirements. And one thing and I see Robert Metz is a financial expert in Austin, Texas. He's here on our call today. He helped me get ready for this speech and some ideas that he sees. He's a forensic CPA genius money person. And he said, one advice he'd give to people is you take this premarital agreement and run it by a financial expert, because you've got lawyers who are not financial experts, right? Drafting up these documents. You want to take it to one of these guys, a CPA. Hey, does this do what I want it to do? What are the tax implications? Because apparently Robert says he sees in a lot of cases where income during the marriage isn't allocated. So the money you make from your job isn't treated at all and it's left out. And usually that's a lot of the way a lot of us get our money. So you could do that too. Now, I say all of this to say, obviously it's the gold legal standard, but you may not want to get your relationship advice from your state's family code, right? This may not be the option for you, and that's okay. Remember, protection, not perfection. Probably if you come from a bunch of money, a bunch of trust, this and that, a bunch of family businesses, you're going to really need to try to get a premarital agreement, especially if you're in one of those equitable division states where it's up to the judge. You need to do this on the front end. Now, for the rest of us, regular folks, you can still do some things to get yourself ready that aren't rising to the level of a premarital agreement. And I call this strategically and even quietly getting your affairs in order. So you don't have to make a big production to your fiance, that you're ensuring you get your money back if this whole thing doesn't work out, right? You can do that sort of quietly behind the scenes. I'm helping a friend do that right now, actually, who's getting married. And I think here, if you're once you get engaged, you're thinking about like picking out the flowers, getting the cake. Equally important is getting your affairs in order on the front end. Now, I think a few things to consider in either jurisdiction. You want to paper your file. So you want to make sure that you have all of the supporting documents for all of your assets, all of your real property, all of your bank accounts. Collect all those documents so you have them in a safe place. Put them on a Dropbox or Google something so you have them. You want to consider the way that any brokerage accounts you have sell securities, because the default is FIFO, first in, first out. You need to swap that so that it goes LIFO, last in, first out. Because think the first in assets, those are going to be premarital or separate property. Last in is going to be marital or community property. So sell that first and maintain your original separate property. That's a big deal. Thanks, Robert Metz. That's a big deal. Most people don't think about that. And it really can cost you a ton of money 20 years later down the line. You want to make sure if you are the beneficiary of a trust that you understand what the trust terms are. And then maybe you talk with your parents or grandparents or trustee to think through, if you get any of that trust money, any of the corpus, any of the interest, how that money will be treated. Just make sure you understand. Because I had a client recently who had no idea what the actual terms of her trust were. She just knew that she got some money and she was getting married. Like, well, we kind of need to figure this out in case maybe some amendments need to be made with your parents or something on the front end. Because sometimes people, the trust beneficiaries may list their child and spouse. Well, then, golly, they have a right to that money, right? So we need to just leave it just to you, if possible, and get that changed. And these laws get real complicated. I see Lauren Fitz. She also helped me in researching for this presentation. She's here today. She's a big time fancy trust lawyer here in Austin. And, in talking with her, my brain starts to spin. So the trust laws can get complicated fast. If this is your world and you live in trust world, make sure you know what's happening there. Another idea that came from Lauren actually was if you're not going to get a prenup, you could sort of act like you're getting a prenup and do one of those statements of assets, even if you don't actually do the agreement. So you could go ahead and make this disclosure to prove up what you had before the marriage, so that 10 or 15 years later, if Robert and me are working on it in the division, we know what was there to start from. And it sounds like not that big of a deal. I mean, that I think is one of the best ideas I can give you, is know what you brought in, don't guess later. And the other thing in both jurisdictions would have to do with real property. You would need to consider if there are any outstanding deeds that need to be recorded or executed. Do that prior to marriage, at least for sure in community property, because that's going to be separate property. But if that deed is after the marriage, you've likely changed the character of that asset and no takebacks. So apparently with mineral interests in Texas, right, they like drill and get all this stuff under the ground. Those deeds can be in arrears and take a while to get done, and they're behind. So you want to make sure you don't let that be behind and happen after your marriage. So handle all of that piece. Now, one thing for my community property folks to really, it's kind of unfair, but hey, it's an option. If you're going to get married and you think you ever want to have your own law firm or CPA firm or painting business, and you ever want to do something like that, create your LLC before you get married, because then you've got a separate property asset. You don't even have to super work up the business before you get married, but you've got that place. Guys like Robert, they're going to look at what are the dates of those documents on the LLC. When do they register with the Secretary of State? Okay. Make all of that happen before the marriage. And a key thing is to make sure you fund it. Go all the way through the steps. So like an LLC agreement, it'll say your capital contribution, let's say for your share in the LLC is $1,000. Literally actually take the $1,000, open the bank account, get the EIN, do all of that piece. So then you can open your law firm or do whatever, and that's going to be treated as a separate asset. upon divorce in community property states. And even furthermore, maybe not apply to a lot of us, but if you think you're going to be one of these wheeler dealer entrepreneur types and want to buy other businesses in the future, start a holding company so that then you can buy the other LLCs within that too. So if you're a business type, definitely consult with a corporate lawyer before you get married and think through potential scenarios and spend some money on the front end. And you could save yourself millions if you are going to be a real successful business person down the line. Okay. Now I'd be remiss to talk about before marriage. So we talked about marital agreements, getting your stuff together. Now, if you're not yet contemplating marriage, but you're thinking about playing house with somebody, okay, you're thinking about buying a house, you just love each other and you want to try on this marriage thing. You've heard that over 50% of people get divorced and you don't know you want to do that. Let's just move in together. I think those people get themselves in a lot of trouble because what'll happen is maybe they'll merge some money. So don't do that. Keep separate bank accounts. But it really comes up if you want to buy a house together. Okay. And usually one person has the money for the down payment and one person doesn't. And they go buy this house. They let the title company just do whatever deeds. They show up, they sign, then they break up. And then what do we do? So a few things you need to make sure of is that you get it titled correctly. Don't just trust the title company. They're going to no offense, really, they're going to title it kind of whatever's easiest or whatever the laws in their state require. But you want to consider, are you taking it in Texas, joint tenants, co-tenants? Is there a right of survivorship? You need to think through how you take title. And a next step would be you really need to get a separate contract with this person of what happens if we break up and we need to sell this place. Does somebody get their full down payment out? What about the cost of repairs? And because the family codes, generally, they're not going to help you in this situation. Okay. You're not a family. Boyfriend, girlfriend is not a class that gets treatment under the family code. Usually. But you're going to be left with property options, evictions, which, COVID, evictions is a whole mess. So make sure you get a separate contract of how that works and just, keep things as separate as you can. Okay. Now, that's all of the before. That's the things you can do before. But I doubt too many people on this call are engaged and just wondering what to do. The rest of us, I'm married, are married. I'm like, okay, Hannah, well, golly, I can't do all that stuff now. So what do I do during the marriage? And look, don't worry if you haven't done everything else, because the best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago, and the next best time is today. So we'll talk about things you can do now to protect yourself. And there are 3 areas where I think we can do this. So what's mine is mine. Keep thorough records as you go. And the best offense is a good defense. So first, let's talk about what's mine is mine. Now, if you follow the advice I'm about to give you in this section and keeping records, you're going to be 95% of the way there. Okay. You're going to have done most of it. Again, protection, not perfection. So the thing you want to do is, generally speaking, keep your separate premarital, non-marital assets separate and keep your marital stuff together. It kind of sounds like duh, Hannah. There's no do not duh, Hannah B, because so many people, you get married and especially professionals who are in their 30s, maybe been working at fancy big law firms. They get married and they have separate bank accounts. And then maybe one person has more. So they just kind of start putting all their joint money in one account because it's easier. That creates this tangled up mess. And in an equitable division jurisdiction, you're going to create a real mess for yourself because you've commingled assets. And then what? In a community property jurisdiction, you're going to create a tracing nightmare, which maybe you can or can't prove up. And tracing costs are real. You think lawyers cost a lot, tracing costs a lot of money. Okay. You don't want to be in that situation. So let's think equitable division, majority of y'all jurisdiction. You want to, after you get married, you come back from your honeymoon, you need to go to the bank. And I want you to create a bank account where you're going to put marital assets. So everything you had before, leave it alone. Do not touch it except for reasons. But you're going to put your paycheck, it's going to go into this marital asset so that you keep it clean. Don't just start dumping the money on top of your old account. Look, and that sounds like a pain in the booty, and it probably is a little bit, but it will save you a lot of time. People don't do this. I'm telling you, they do not do this. That's not going to be you, because here you are. You're talking to me. You're going to know better than to do this. Remember, don't commingle your funds. You're going to keep that money separate. If you do the new bank account, that's going to help a lot. And do not add your spouse to title to any documents. Don't take, or assets. Don't take money from separate and buy an asset that you take in joint title, or it's good as gone. Okay. And the same concept applies in community property jurisdictions, but it's a little bit different. You want to keep your separate stuff separate. It's good to have a new bank account for your paychecks and everything. But remember, red paint money, you can find it later. And we'll talk about, how to make sure you do that. But one thing I think that's really important that people don't think about is, if you have a separate property, let's say the house, so many times this happens, or you're, especially if you're a blended family, somebody's coming into the marriage likely with a house. And maybe everybody moves into this person's, the husband's separate property house. But during the marriage, the income from the husband's job pays for the mortgage on the separate property house. Well, what's happened is you've done one of those loan things. You've created a reimbursement. You're using community property funds. He'll think it's his money, his money. Okay, that's his money from his job. People always think, if they don't know better, that's my money. No, I earned that at my job. It's half hers or half your other spouse's money. Okay, but so if you take that and you pay it on the mortgage on the separate property debt, at the end of the day, when division, you're going to have to pull that money back out. So if at all possible, satisfy separate property debts with separate property money. So if you're fortunate and you came in with a decent little bit of money in a bank account, or you get a big inheritance from your great Aunt Myrtle who dies or whatever, use that money to pay for your separate property so you don't create those reimbursement claims. And if you don't, keep really good records of what gets paid, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Now, the other thing we want to think about is how you work with your business. Because remember, this business is separate and all its growth is going to be yours. So it's really important that you maintain it. And the key advice here is, look, treat it the way you should treat it to maintain your LLC status. So observe corporate formalities. Don't use it as your personal piggy bank. You don't run the business card when you go to HEB or Kroger or Target for Christmas. You don't put the family's Disney cruise on the business card. Treat it as you should, a separate entity, and spend money for business purposes. Okay, so protect that corporate form. You also want to make sure that you don't just sit on this Scrooge McDuck pile of money in the business. Okay, I'm thinking of him sitting on all the gold coins. And you want to make sure you distribute those funds. You want to give yourself a reasonable salary. So that's just for IRS reasons, but also later you can create a claim for reimbursement, that loan repayment kind of thing between the estates, basically. If you don't pay yourself a reasonable salary, because the community will say, wait a minute, you could have made more money just being a painter, a paint man owner of somebody else's business, because you didn't pay yourself enough of a salary. So pay yourself enough salary and make sure you distribute enough funds to cover the taxes on your business, because otherwise you're going to create that reimbursement claim. So distribute enough money for a good salary and make sure that's enough to cover the taxes, or you'll have a reimbursement issue down the line. And let's see. Oh, the other thing when it comes to what's mine is mine, you need to think about, in either jurisdiction, the laws on how dividends and income on separate or premarital property is treated. Is that a marital or community asset subject to division or not? And look, on not that much money, it's not that big of a deal. But if you've got a sizable separate estate, that income can make a big difference. And in some situations, you reinvest the dividends and income. And if that's community in your state, then you're commingling and creating a mess, right? Because you have to trace out the reinvested dividends and income and then that growth versus the separate. I've seen it. It's a mess. The spreadsheets, oh my God, make your head spin. So make sure you understand And instead of maybe reinvesting, just take the distribution, pay the taxes, and use the money that way. Now, so we've kept what's mine is mine. The next thing is keep thorough records. Listen, if you don't give a care about anything else I say, or you don't listen to anything else I'm saying today, your takeaway needs to be this: keep thorough records. I'm saying that I'm preaching to the choir. I'm not really a keep thorough records person. I don't have file folders where I make label makers. If you're that sort of person, I mean, you're already doing this. For the rest of us sort of stack people, this is an area for real improvement. And I say this, I've had it come up in cases recently because banks only have to keep your records for 7 years. And we're all really used to this idea. I'll just log in online and get my statements. Well, if you're married 20, 25, I mean, sometimes people get divorced after 40, 50 years. That bank's not going to have your statements from back then. And to, at least in community property jurisdictions, to trace the money, that red paint money, you have to have clear and convincing evidence. That's above preponderance, right? It means real sure, I guess. Absolutely sure, almost. So to do that, you have to show chains of titles. So that's deeds, closing statements, things like that. It's also the money. Follow the money, honey. Okay. You do that with the bank statements. So make it a point not to rely that online and forever from now you're going to have them. So my thought was, look, once a year, if you're like not a download everyday person, once a year, go in on the same day, put it on your calendar to download all your bank statements for the year. Or if you have an assistant, like if I own my own firm, small firm, give maybe a job an assistant could help you with. Just download them, put them in the Dropbox 2020s, Chase Bank account XYZ statements. Just throw them in there. And a lot of them don't have copies of checks, the fronts and backs anymore. So you need to check with your bank and see if you can get that function where it'll give you copies of checks. Because in that tracing exercise I was telling you about, what does the check say really comes up more than you would think it would. So what does the memo say? Down payment on this house from separate funds, right? You want to see a picture of that check. So see if that's an option with your bank. And if it's not, you may consider finding a bank who will do that for you. You may have to even request them separate. So especially a big transaction, you want to do that. The other thing you want to do is make sure and keep hold of all plan documents, vesting, like if you have investment, retirement benefits, pension stuff, 401k, brokerage accounts, keep all vesting schedules, all plan documents, all award letters. Because look, the job you had at Google, when you first got married, and you now work for a small mom and pop thing that you started or whatever with a friend a lot later, we can't rely on being able to go back 20 years and say, hey, about those award letters, I didn't keep them. Can I get a copy? HR is not going to have a copy of that stuff 20 years later. So if you get a paper, scan it in, save it to the same place where you're keeping everything. And look, you don't have to advertise this to your spouse. You don't have to advertise that you're protecting yourself. Because, look, how would you feel if you stumbled upon your spouse doing that? I think just, you don't have to keep it a secret, but you don't have to necessarily advertise and tell them to do it too, right? Just be fair that they're doing it too. The other thing you want to do is keep copies of all closing documents. So if you purchase real estate, rental properties, mineral interest, whatever, title documents, keep all of that stuff. Because I'll tell you one thing for sure. You will not remember in 10 years which of those title companies you used to close that house to get those documents back. And you'll have to spend forever going through all the title companies in Miami to figure out which one you use that time, because they all have the same Republic of National of this, right? So it's going to be hard to figure out on the back end. It's a real pain. I've had clients have to do it. So keep all of those. And if you use a cashier's check and you take it to closing, sneak a picture of that front and back, make a copy, get a copy, so you can have, hey, that's a clear and convincing evidence. Here's the check. I removed money from account A. Here's a copy of the check to make the purchase into property B. That connects the dots, the loops there. The other thing is about checks. Commercial paper. Y'all remember that from the bar. But I talk about checks a lot more than probably most people in their life because people still do use checks, and it's a handwritten document with meaning. So utilize the memo portion of them their checks, y'all. Okay. So if it's a gift, if somebody's giving you a gift, if it's a down payment, write in the memo what that is. Because y'all remember a gift, the elements of a gift are intent, delivery, and acceptance. So we can infer some intent or read your intent from the memo portion of your check. So make sure you utilize that. And the last, or second to last, I guess, um, thing to think about is in terms of gifts. Okay. Happens all the time. Parents give a married couple $10,000 for whatever the reason is. And they make the check out to, Bob and Susie Smith, to both. The parent probably really meant to kind of give a present to their son, but they put it to both because it kind of felt weird. Well, hey, there's a check to both. That's to both, right? That's going to both of y'all. That's a gift to both. So if your parents are trying to get some money to you, have them just put it in your name, number one. Number two, in the memo, we're going to write gift to Bobby in the memo. And the other sort of like next level thing, this is a Robert wishes all of you would do this. So when he's working on your case, have your parents execute what's called a declaration of gift, right? Where that's, I intended to give a gift on this day of this much only to my son, sign it contemporaneous, like at the same time, or this jewelry or this whatever to my kid, and get them to sign it and keep it. And you date it, 10 years prior. And later when you're talking about it, that very fancy watch, Rolex something, I meant it to be a gift. It's not sort of this joint thing. So that's really gold. That will really save you down the line, especially as people get older and parents are giving away their stuff. Make sure it's clear that it's a gift. Now, the other area where I think records could become a big deal is if you create a business during your marriage. Okay. So you get married, you're just young kids, y'all don't have nothing. And then late lawyers, right? So we're lawyers. And then 5 years in, you want to leave your big, fancy, tall building Miami law firm, and you want to start a mom and pop plaintiff shop, okay, with you and a partner. Now, then what? In a community property state, that's a community property business. In an equitable division state, that's a marital asset. But there is something you can do. You could, at that juncture, consider using this as a reason to get a marital agreement. Like, hey, babe, I've got this partner and both of us have to do this for the business. They're requiring it from us. The lawyer said so. We need to do a marital agreement, because you can do the prenup idea. You can do it after marriage. It's just called a post-nup, post-marital, something like that. That's one option. The other thing you want to try to do, and this is where you're going to talk to a corporate lawyer, is you can get a spousal consent with the LLC. So that's sort of like a buy-sell provision that just says upon divorce, it lays out the way that spouse's interests, those shares, will be treated upon divorce. So it's sort of a buyout provision for the spouse that, hey, they're not going to try to actually take over and start being a partner in this business that, they can't in the lawyer business generally, but, like a painting company, they're not going to come run the paint shop or create a mess. So during the marriage, you're going to, what's mine is mine. Keep separate things separate, keep personal, and business. You're going to keep thorough records as you go. And then the third thing you're going to do is remember that the best offense is a good defense. Now, one way that people don't think about is when it comes to your estate planning documents. I am like continually shocked. I do some of this. I'm continually shocked how little thought or energy or effort or money people put into this. Really wealthy people die without any estate planning documents in place. It's so stupid. Okay. Do not do that. You need to have it done. Make it your end of your thing you're going to do, if nothing else. Because here's something to keep in mind, especially like in blended families. Some of this advice is really blended family specific. But if you have a will prior to marriage and then you get married, in a lot of states, if your spouse was not considered in this prior will, of course not, you weren't married to them, and you don't have a will after marriage, then if you die, the state's going to treat that other will as invalid, and give the spouse what they would have been entitled to if you had died intestate without a will. Okay. That's a big deal. If you left everything to your kids, your blended family, you did a new will, you gave everything to your kids, you get remarried, you don't do a new will, at least in Texas, that's a pre-termitted spouse's situation. I always thought that was hard in law school, but it just means your spouse is going to get her half in Texas if you don't set it up right. So what you need to do is just re-execute those documents. Or I think you can do a codicil, like an update thing after, that says, oh no, I really did mean to leave everything to my kids. You can still do it, just update it after marriage. You want to make sure, like, update your life insurance beneficiaries, update your, if you have joint accounts or different, brokerage accounts, who those accounts are going to, if you want it to be your spouse or not, if you want it to be your kids or not. Just keep in mind, if you leave money direct to kids who are under 18 in a Uniform Transfer to Minors Act, those kids have to have some sort of a guardian or something to take over the money and spend it. So you really don't want to leave it to them directly. You want to leave it in trust for them with somebody else, grandma, sister, somebody else managing that money. And in a blended family, this is really important, because if you leave direct life insurance money to your kids and you're divorced, guess who's going to be their guardian if you don't do something else of that money? Your ex-husband. And I kind of can't think of a more annoying, terrible situation for a lot of us than if that were the case. So update that stuff. And one idea that Lauren gave me, I thought this was really smart. If, say, you get remarried in a blended family and you're worried about, what if I got divorced? I want to make sure there's enough money for the kids, but if it gets confusing and she's going to take part, one thing you could do is fully fund 529 plans. Put money into funding the kids' college with your separate asset. That money, once it's in, it's in. You're not going, you have to use it for education. So that's one way to protect some assets, while you're married. But be careful. Some people are like, oh, I'll put it all in a trust. But be careful, because you're going to get the money stuck in that trust or in the 529 plan. You may need it later. So just kind of balance how much you're going to put in there with the protection goal. And the last area of this, and it can get really complicated, this is me thinking like a custody lawyer, are discovery considerations during your marriage if you're a blended family. Because at least in Texas, if there are further modifications of custody, your financial records will come in. They have, or at least can be discovered, because they could lead to admissible evidence in the future. And you don't want your new spouse's credit card statement coming into evidence because you're a joint account holder, or how she spends her money. She goes, shopping all the time. You don't want your new, your ex-spouse to get a copy of that. So one thing to do is kind of create this wall in your marriage where you're not on each other's bank accounts. You keep that part separate to protect yourself from opening up to discovery and custody litigation. Because if you have the custody and control and the right to that information, you can be made to hand it over. And we don't want that to happen, at least try not to. So consider creating a wall with your data, with your information, to protect your new spouse from a nefarious ex-spouse just being nosy. Okay. Now, last area to think about is, what about after marriage? So, we know what we're going to do before. We're trying to get a prenup. We're going to get our stuff together. During the marriage, we're going to keep things separate, get good records, and think through how to be defensive for a good offensive strategy. And last thing we're going to do is, after you're married, it's really, if you think about it, likely the beginning of the next cycle. You're after marriage, you're again before marriage in the future. Most people get remarried. I don't care what they say. Every person getting divorced says, I'm never getting remarried again. I hate men. I hate women. They're all liars, whatever. They all get remarried like a year later. It happened. I said the same thing. I got remarried a couple years later. So one thing you want to do after marriage, some of the advice is the same of the offense defense. You want to get new estate planning documents. You want to update all those beneficiaries. Imagine you do all this to get divorced and it's horrible and you hate each other, but you forgot to update some of those insurance beneficiaries or brokerage account, beneficiaries, or transfer on death deeds, and it goes to your ex. I mean, oh my God. So you absolutely, after you get divorced, need to make sure you update all of that. Get with a really good financial planner, like a solid, smart one you trust to help you think that through. A really good trust lawyer, it's worth the money and the time to do that. I really think so, because you can have a lot of unintended consequences. And here's the deal. If you get divorced, you'll be tempted to be like, bye, I'm out, I'm done. I don't want to think about this anymore, and throw it all in a drawer. Do not do that. You need to finish strong. Do that last little piece. And hopefully your family lawyer will help you think about those things you need to do on the back end to do that. The other thing you want to do, obviously, is learn from your mistakes. So that's kind of why I got into family law. I worked in a big fancy law firm doing employment law before I got divorced. I went through this whole messy thing. And my whole practice is based on helping others not make the same mistakes that I made while in the divorce and custody process. I want you to do the same thing. If you're after marriage, you need to take some reflect, get you a journal, sit by the lake. What did I learn? What am I going to do differently? What's important to me? That step, that sort of reflection is super important for your continued success in the future. And one thing people don't think about, I didn't even know this was a thing till it came up in my work, is if you're a gray divorce, and I say gray meaning, your kids are out of the house, you're in your 50s, maybe 60s. I mean, I had a client in their 70s, 80s, it's horrible. But you're older, and you need to understand the impact on your potential remarriage to your entitlement to Social Security benefits. A lot of people don't know this. If you're married over 10 years and both of y'all are over 62 and able to, eligible for Social Security benefits, if the person who wants them, so that's pretend it's me, if I wanted those and my ex-spouse's benefits would be more than what I would receive under my own benefits, like if I was a stay-at-home mom or a teacher or whatever, and they were some fancy job and had, pretty good money in Social Security, I'm entitled, if I'm not remarried, to take under my ex-spouse's benefits, not just my own, so long as I'm not remarried. Doesn't matter if he's remarried, okay? So I'll have some clients like, look, they're in their 60s and they're dating this guy, and it's like, maybe date him, but let's just not walk down the aisle, because you could cost yourself, $1,000 a month, $2,000. It's not a fortune, but for people on fixed income, it makes a really big difference. And I didn't know that's a thing. So if that's you or your mom or your aunt or your grandma or whatever, tell them, hey, we need to make sure before you get remarried, think about what the cost of that is going to be. And all in all, the takeaway from there is just look, you're going to be back on the before. And you'll be smarter, wiser. Nothing makes you more sort of worldly, I think, than getting divorced. You learn a whole lot. And so in sum, we're not going to be perfect, guys. Okay. We're not going to solve every problem, but at least my goal in talking to you all today is just to make sure that you know what's going to happen to you, that you become financially literate in the way this stuff works, and know what's coming to you. So thank you for your time. If anybody has any questions, or Frank, I'm happy to help or whatever. I may not know the answer, but I'll either fake it or tell you where to find out.
Well, thanks so much, Hannah. I recommend that you follow her on LinkedIn. She posts regular videos about family law. They're short, quick videos that are very much similar in the vein of today's presentation. They're very educational and very conversational. And if people want to follow you, Hannah, where can they follow you on?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. If you search up Hembree Bell Law, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. I think that's the at symbol is Hembree Bell Law. And on LinkedIn, I'm just Hannah Hembree Bell. Hembree is my maiden name. It's my middle name now.
And what's your website?
It's austindivorcelawyers.us. And we have a YouTube. That would be great if you want to go to the YouTube. All the kids are doing it, guys. All your kids are doing it. But you can push subscribe, so then you get a notice. I get all kinds of notices on my phone from like the boys with Fortnite and everything. But apparently you can do that for even get you a little notice in your Fortnite. Oh, look, Christine with my firm is here. So she posted, woo, girl, go. She posted all the ways to do all the things on there.
That's great. So this was recorded, and if you had to drop off, or if you want to listen to it again, we'll make it available, as I'm sure Hannah will through her firm. And
Frank, one
her
more
presentation.
Thing.
Go right ahead.
Okay, I meant to say this in the beginning. So I talked about Robert. I'm obviously a fangirl of Robert Metz, who's on here, and Lauren Fitt. I also wanted to thank Tracy Rhodes, who's in Georgia. I think, Frank, I think y'all are friends on LinkedIn too. She helped me understand the way equitable division works, and we're all super helpful as I got ready for this. Because I'm from Texas, and we think a lot about Texas and not a lot about everywhere else. So I had to figure some of that out. So appreciate
Well,
y'all's help.
again, great presentation. I don't see any questions. Let me make sure of that. No, I don't see any. Feel free to reach out to Hannah directly. Again, feel free to download the video. And thanks so much for your time today. And
Thanks, everybody.
thanks so much for everybody joining us. And hopefully we'll be doing this again soon. Have a great one.